Now let's talk about closures. In fact, it's a very simple concept if you don't wrap it in complicated terms. So, what is a closure? Essentially, it's just a function inside another function. And that's it. Now let's figure out how this works. For example, I will create a new function, which I will call, for instance, createCalc function. This is a regular function, and what will it do? It will return something to us, and that something will be another function. And let's say, for example, let's output the following value in the console, for instance, 1000 multiplied by some n. And we will pass this variable n, for example, into the createCalc function. Now, what can we do with this function? Essentially, we can call it. So here, I will write createCalc function and, for example, pass the value 42 to it. I will save it, and let's see what we get as a result if I refresh the page. And we won't get anything. Why? Because when we call the createCalc function, it actually returns a new function. And therefore, we can store it in a separate variable. That is, let's say I create a variable calc, and as a result, I assign to it what the createCalc function returns. Calc is indeed actually a function that we get from another function. And therefore, if we just leave everything as it is, or, for example, log what calc is to the console, we will see that it is a regular function, so we can call it. Let's just write calc for this. I'll save it. And what do you think the result will be? So, we passed 42 here and multiplied it by 1000. However, we call the function calc without parameters. But if I reset the page, we will get 42,000. And this is how it works. When we called the createCalc function and passed the number 42 to it, the createCalc function executed and returned a new function to us. But considering that this function was called in the context of the createCalc function, this variable n was sort of enclosed in the function that we return. And that's why, whenever we call the function calc, it already contains the value of n, meaning the function has closed over it. And that's why it's called a closure. It means we get specific access to the scope of the outer function. Now let's look at specific examples to understand how this can be useful to us and how it actually works. Let's say I just comment all this out and write the creation of another function. For example, I will call it createIncrementer. This function will work on the same principle and it will return a new function to us, which in turn will return the sum of two numbers, for example, the parameter n that we will pass to the upper function, and some value that we will pass to this function, let's say m. And here we will simply sum them up. Now, how do we use this? Let's say I can create a variable add1, and it will be a specific function for us because we will get it from the function createIncrementer, and let's say we want to close the variable n on the value of 1, which is why I named the function add1. Now, look at what happens. Let's say I will output the function add1 in the console, and I can pass some new value to it. And this value will match the variable number. So, let's say I pass 10 here. What do you think the result will be? So, we call the function add1 with the parameter 10. If I refresh the page, it makes sense that we get 11 here. If, for instance, I call the function add1 with the value, say, 41, then in the console we will get the value 42, because the function add1 has enclosed the value of 1 within itself and constantly adds 1. Now we can use the same createIncrementer function and create another function, for example, add10. We call the function createIncrementer, let's say with the value 10. And now let's repeat the logic that I wrote down. Suppose we will call the function add10 with the same values. But considering that we have enclosed the value 10 in it, as a result, we will get the corresponding values 20 and 51. This is because the function add10 now always adds 10, and so on. In essence, we use one main function to enclose certain values, and as a result, we get another function that can work with different parameters. And let's suppose we write another simple example to practice closures a bit more. I will comment all of this out. Let's say I create a function, which I will call URL generator. And this function will return a new function to us, yes, because we are working with closures, which in turn will return a string to us. Here I will use backticks. Let's assume we will always add the HTTPS protocol, followed by 2 slashes. After that, we want to add the name of the link we want to generate. So let's say here I write that I accept a URL parameter URL, and then I want to add some domain name through a dot, but I don't really want to add it statically all the time. So here I will accept a domain parameter and output the domain here. Now we have a URL generator function and how to use it. Essentially, it's all the same. That is, we create some new function. Let's say com.url. This is a function that was derived from another function called URL generator, and we need to pass that domain into it. That is, I named the function com, so I will pass the string .com here. Now let's look at how this works in the console. Let's say we generate a few links. That is, I will call the function com.url, for example, with the string Google, and this string will already match the URL parameter. If I save everything and refresh the page, we get the URL https.google.com as a result. Yes, if we want to generate another link, for example, Netflix, I'm not sure if that's how it's spelled, but anyway, we get the corresponding link as a result. So we just pass the name, and everything else is generated. And we don't specify .com anywhere here either, because this function always returns the domain name with .com. We can do the same for the RU domain name, so I can create a ru.url function, call the generator function, and pass the .ru domain name to it. I can do the same with another function, meaning I can call the ru.url function twice. Let's say the first link will be to Yandex, and the second link will be to, for example, VK. vContact used to have a .ru domain name. Yes, and now, accordingly, we get new links. That is vk.ru and yandex.ru. If we do the same thing, say, with another function, for example, com.url, we will get the link vk.com. And actually, that's all there is to it, meaning there's nothing more to say about closures because everything about them is explained in this line, and this is how you can use them. Now let's practice a bit. And for this, I came up with the following task, which is quite often asked in interviews, and by this time we have already acquired all the necessary knowledge to solve it. So, what is the idea? We need to write our own bind function, and then I showed how it should work. That is, the bind function takes a certain context, binds this context to the desired function, and returns a new function. As context, we use two objects, person1 and person2, and then we call the bind function separately because we need to implement it ourselves, not as a method of existing functions. So, try pausing the video and applying all the knowledge we've just covered to solve this task. But now, I'll show you how I did it. And to start, let's use, for example, the keyword function to define the bind function. And what does this function take as input? Essentially, it takes some context as the first parameter that we need to bind. Therefore, here I will accept the context. As a second parameter, it takes a function, some function fn. And then, for all this to work, we need to return a new function, that is, to use closures. And here we will call the apply method on the function fn, and now I will explain why. To the first method, we will pass the context, and as the second parameter in the apply method, we should pass an array of parameters. To make our bind function universal and able to accept any number of parameters from 0 to n, because they can be infinite, we need to somehow determine how these parameters are passed. And for this, we use apply, because we pass an array into it. And we can get the array in the inner function, where we will pass this array of args using the spread operator. It is an array. and all the necessary parameters that will be moved to this function are included. And that's basically it. Now let's just check how it works. For this, I will copy what I wrote above. I will save it. And let's refresh the page. As a result, we won't get anything because the bind function returns some new value. So we need to call it. If I call them and refresh the page, we basically get the expected result. That is, as you can see, in the console we first output person1 and person2. This means we bind the necessary context to the same function, but through our own implementation.